This episode of Distraction is sponsored by Landmark College. Try their free comparison tool for colleges with learning disability support at lcdistraction.org. Landmark College. Learn your way. Succeed uniquely.
What I've learned over the years as a coach, it's a lot easier to change your environment than it is to change yourself. I'm going to reiterate that. It's a lot easier to change your environment than it is to change yourself.
Hello, this is Dr. Ned Hallowell, and welcome to Distraction. Today I'm very happy to welcome as a guest Jeff Cooper, who has a wonderful show, AttentionTalkRadio.com, as well as DigCoaching.com. Jeff is a veteran of the world of attention, of procrastination, of clever thinking, creative minds, and is just a wonderful person to welcome to our little corner of the world. So, Jeff, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm real excited about this conversation.
Well, it's great to have you. Where shall we start? What is your favorite topic today? What's uppermost on your mind?
Well, I'm the type of person, and there's other people out there who sometimes need to understand kind of what's behind some of the challenges. And by understanding it, many people can then very cleverly figure out strategies or structures to kind of move them forward. So one of my big topics is the impact of working memory on procrastination. And if you're game, I'd like to talk a little bit about working memory and kind of run through a little bit of metaphor and then kind of talk about how it impacts procrastination and then kind of talk about some mindsets and some ideas to help people that can identify with this, maybe get past some of that.
That sounds great. You just make sure we all know what we're talking about. What is working memory?
Well, working memory is basically holding thoughts and ideas in your mind and kind of juggling in them and organizing them. Ned, one of the things that I do with my clients is I'll say 5 words to them, and they're like hippopotamus, bumblebee, kangaroo, zebra, and teacher. And then I ask them to repeat them back to me in alphabetical order. And interestingly enough, about half the time people with ADHD forget a word or they get the order wrong. And I do that with them because I say, you notice that you didn't learn anything new. You had to organize those and repeat it back to me. You got to hold them in your memory to do that. And I do that because they can begin to see what working memory really is, and we can begin to talk about how it impacts their world. The other thing that I like to do is I described, years ago I had a computer that was somewhat old. In the morning I would turn it on. It would take about 5 minutes for it to boot up. Imagine if I waited 5 minutes and I opened Microsoft Word and I started typing you a letter, had a couple sentences into it, and all of a sudden the power went out. Well, I'd have to restart my computer and boot up the operating system and Skype and all the tools that I use. And imagine I opened up Microsoft Word and found what I was writing to you and started to read it because I couldn't remember what I was saying to you. Then I started to kind of continue forward and I lost power again. Again, I power the thing up and we go through this rebooting process. And I like to share, if you think of working memory as that booting up process of loading everything and all the tools and the thoughts in your mind in order to do something, to juggle things, like it might be your taxes or you might be writing a research paper or for you writing a book. In that moment, you can see when that power gets unplugged, you kind of basically have to start over. And so one of the things that I have found in helping people with ADHD is if you're working on a project, people talk about, I'm having a hard time getting started. I'm having a hard time getting into it. Or if you have a project that is somewhat vague, if you go into it without thinking about it, often what you'll do is you'll get started and you don't realize it's very effortful in order to kind of boot up your mind to get it ready to work, particularly if it requires a lot of thinking. And often what I find is people, when they get into that, they'll get distracted, like, hey, come help me with this. And they get up and they go into the other room and they come back. And effectively, they have to start the process over again. And if you've got an environment where there's a lot of interruptions or you've got appointments that you're not doing and you can't finish what you're doing, what I find is people end up effectively starting over and over and over. And what that happens over a period of time is they begin to procrastinate on starting they don't think about it consciously, but they don't actually kind of get started into it because intuitively that they know they don't have enough time to finish what they're doing.
So you're talking about the effort it takes to hold data in your mind at one time being analogous to the effort it takes to boot up a computer.
Yep. Think about construction guys. They show up at a house and, they bring all their tools out and they get it all set up. All that stuff has to be done before they start working on the house that day.
Mm-hmm.
Some tasks are really easy and they don't require a lot of boot up, but some tasks require a lot of executive function. They take a lot of time. And for people with ADHD, if you actually acknowledge that and you begin to say, how can I boot up my computer? Or when I'm in the middle of a project, if I've got to go do something else, how do I come back? Effectively kind of put your project on hibernate, if you will, so that when you come back and you restart it, you don't have to start from the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll share a personal thing that I do is I coach probably 6 or 7 people a day, and each one of them are like an individual project, if you will. So when I'm working with them, what I do is when I get done coaching them, I dictate just a stream of consciousness of what I was thinking during the call. It doesn't even have to be logical.
Mm-hmm.
It gets transcribed. And then before they call, I skim through what I dictated. Now, note, I don't actually read everything. I just skim through it. And it's interesting because the buzzwords and stuff, I can recall probably about 85% of the conversation that we had before just by skimming through it. I don't have to sit there and recall it all. That's an example of getting into a project and really loading all that stuff in my head quickly so that I can be effective on the call.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what's this supposed to help people to do?
It's help people to actually identify that when they're going to sit down to do a project, 2 things happen. One is they have to acknowledge, I've got to find a way to kind of get my head into it, and I'll talk about that in a second. And the other one is when you're in the middle of a project and you're getting distracted, before you get up and leave, you need to leave some type of clues or some type of thought process of what you were doing so that when you come back, effectively, you don't have to start all over again. Because loading those thoughts into your mind takes so much time.
So for me as a writer, it's really nice that I leave off and can start up where I left off, and I have some sentences there to cue me right there to where I left off.
Yeah, often people will go back and reread some of the part of what they read. Like earlier, I was describing the booting up process that I would go back and reread what I was writing, you then trying to remember what I was going to say next.
Mm-hmm.
So again, effectively kind of going backwards and rereading maybe the last chapter that you wrote to kind of get your flow back.
Mm-hmm.
For some people, like students, I've had them where if they just sit down and talk to somebody about the material that they're covering, a lot of times it'll come back to them a little bit quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Other ideas is just kind of skimming through what you've got with a highlighter, or even before you stop, is you actually draw a diagram or jot down some notes or leave some things, and then you come back and you read through those notes or those diagrams, if you will, before you start up. Again, the idea is it's to reduce the amount of effort to kind of get back to where you left off before you started working on the project. Make sense?
Yeah, it does.
The other thing in the process is actually to acknowledge is that if you've got something that's really, really challenging, that requires a lot of thought process, if you can externalize it. A lot of times I find people with ADHD, they'll start a project and they leave everything out, and effectively it's twofold. One is they don't like to put it away because it's burdensome to do that, but when they come back, if the project is laid out on a table, a lot of times that actually helps them get their head into it. Again, boot up the computer. So in one sense, that notion of putting it away is nice because it removes that clutter, but also sometimes that becomes the barrier for them to get started back on the project because one, it's out of sight, out of mind, or number two, they have to go through that, laying everything out again, and then begin to remember where they were. That's much more effortful than if they just came back and could visually see where they were to leave off and start it over again.
So having the visual reminder.
Yeah. So again, this is one of those things that as people go and they begin to watch what they're doing, they think about it, it can be very, very helpful. Other things, too, is if you're in the middle of a project, I find some people with ADHD are particularly sensitive to sound or light or different types of things. And effectively, if you get distracted in the middle of a project, your thoughts evaporate and you have to go back to the beginning. So some people that are sensitive to sound, certainly noise-canceling headphones, or I've had people that were writing and actually had a vacuum cleaner next to them with it running. So if somebody slammed the door, it wouldn't get their attention because it was muted out by the sound. Other people I've worked with where they bright light. would catch their eye, so they would sit with very bright fluorescent lights so that if there was a flicker or something, they wouldn't notice it. And then some other people, that notion of really putting a miner's light on their, like a headlight on top of their head, like a camping headlight.
Where do you get those, by the way? Where do you get a miner's light? I guess eBay or?
You can get them for about $10 at Walmart.
Really? They sell them at Walmart?
Yep.
No kidding.
In fact, my son was backpacking in Machu Picchu, and before we left, I found like 2 for $1 for $10. But
no kidding.
In a moment like that, you just sit in a dark room with the lights off, where there's no distractions. You put the light on, and it kind of mutes everything else out that you might look at. And so again, it allows you to get your head into the game and really focus on it. You know, I think I believe that you're friends with Peter Shankman.
Oh, sure. Yeah, sure. Yep.
He tells the story of how he booked a ticket from New York to Tokyo to write a book.
Yep.
It's funny because it sounds crazy that he would spend a couple $1,000s to do it, but by sitting on the airplane and removing himself from the distractions, he could focus in on it.
Yeah.
It's a funny story. It's believable because it's a true story, because he got in trouble when he got back to New York because he didn't get his passport stamped in Tokyo, so they wouldn't let him back in. So that's how you know that's a true story.
Right, exactly.
But again, that's a big project that Peter needed to sit down and really focus uninterrupted for a period of time, and he had been procrastinating on it for a period of time, and just sat down and did it. So he sequestered himself so he wouldn't get interrupted.
Right.
The key to this really, though, is to understand the working memory, that piece of it, and if you can begin to witness where you are in the process, you can begin to watch. A lot of times you'll avoid large projects that require a lot of working memory because you don't have the time to get into it effectively. You wouldn't have to start over and over again, because again, you wouldn't want to start the project 3 or 4 times over because it's not as efficient use of time. You'd certainly want to sit down and do it the entire time, which is another reason, right, to schedule a day where you can sit down and focus on it without interruption or distraction.
Yeah, also the good ways of sort of jump-starting yourself into a project so you don't have to boot up your mind every time.
Absolutely. Which is certainly effortful. And, if you're going to do something that's really challenging, like a very dry research paper or taxes, understand that process of finding a good area, sitting down maybe with a cup of coffee, taking medication, removing the distractions, and actually expecting it to take maybe 15 or 20 minutes for you to kind of reel through the information and kind of get comfortable with it, because it sometimes will take time. And if you're impatient, or you're not expecting it, sometimes you'll try it for 5 minutes and go off and do something else without the realization. Sometimes it takes a while if it requires a lot of extra effort and a lot of extra thinking.
Right. How about one of your favorite topics, procrastination?
Well, again, another thing that I find that's fascinating for procrastination is a lot of times I find that people procrastinate because they're not really clear on what to do. If you don't really know what to do, then you don't necessarily do it. Where I found a lot of success with people where you sit there and say, okay, what is it you're not clear about? What do you need to do? And I focus in on that in order to move yourself forward. So I'll tell a simple story around this. I was coaching a guy. One of the things he was procrastinating on was calling his family to tell them about his daughter's piano recital. And so I asked him, well, what's hard about calling your relatives? He said, it's not hard, it's easy. I said, well, it's on your procrastination list. He said, yeah. I said, well, if it was easy, you would have done it. So what's hard about it? We went back a couple times on that, and finally he goes, well, now that I think about it, a lot of times I will call and they'll say, where do we park? What do we wear? And maybe what do we bring? And in that moment, he realized that he didn't really have the answers to that. So he doesn't know the questions that he'd be asking. He doesn't know the answers. So now he's got to go back to his wife, who was upset that this is one more thing that he's tasked him with, like, why can't he do it? So that's a little bit difficulty, and find out what's going on. So in the moment that we begin to identify whatever he's working on, say, what am I not clear about, he can begin to go, oh, I'm missing this information, and go ask for that as a means to move forward, as opposed to just kicking it down the street without knowing that the reason he's not doing it is he really doesn't know what to do, or he's missing some information. In this scenario, once we cracked the code on that, it was pretty funny, because anything that he was tasked to do with his wife, he'd always say, okay, what information do I need that I'm not asking to go along with that? And that facilitated a very interesting conversation where often he got that information through her help in talking out loud and was then able to do it. Had a profound impact on his ability to work through his list. Another example I find is a lot of times people with ADHD, they know what to do. They just don't necessarily know how to do it. So they might say, I need to do a newsletter. They know what a newsletter feels like, but they have a lot of difficulty coming up with what they want to write in the newsletter. And so that's another situation where sometimes talking to somebody and bouncing ideas off of it so they're externalizing and interacting with it can help them gain some insight on maybe what they should write. Because once they kind of have the idea or the angle, often I find they sit down and write it, but the idea is they don't really know how to pitch it. Maybe an example, what person to write it in. That's just a metaphor, but how am I going to convey the point? In what way do I want to go about doing this? Again, that's sometimes a very iterative process. It's a trial and error. And again, doing it with somebody else to gain some insight on what you want to do helps people sit down and actually write it. So again, another illustration of working through the ambiguity to figure out what you got. Once you get the clarity, I find often many people with ADHD will move forward on it.
Can I ask you a question that we received from a listener?
Yep.
What is the secret motivation or technique that enables people, young and old, to make and review lists of things to be done in the future, to remember how much time they take, and then actually do them in a timely fashion?
Okay. So to me, the trick, what I've learned over the years as a coach, it's a lot easier to change your environment than it is to change yourself. And I'm going to reiterate that. It's a lot easier to change your environment than it is to change yourself. So I'm going to share an example of what that looks like. Now, it's not going to sound doable in this particular situation, but just bear with me so we can begin to work our way through it. And that is, repetitive and boring tasks tend to be difficult for those with ADHD, and things that require a lot of executive functioning tend to be difficult for those with ADD.
Yes.
And they very often struggle to do that by themselves. However, in the company of somebody else, often they're able to do it. There's an old saying, many times people with ADHD can do for others what they can't do for themselves.
Yes.
And usually when they're doing it with others, they're doing it with them as opposed to all by themselves.
Yes.
So in an environment where you're doing it with somebody, you've actually changed the environment. It's not the same thing. And there's a social component, and you have the ability to talk out loud with somebody, which makes it easier for your working memory. And then in that situation, since it's easier and you've got somebody to accompany the environment, it's a little bit easier, and you're more motivated to do it socially, and it's less taxing, and that's what enables you often to get the things done that you don't ordinarily get done.
I think that's a great tip.
I was a scholarship athlete in college, actually ranked in the world one time, used to swim 15,000 yards a day. And I can tell you right now, I've exercised my entire life, but I preach this. Exercise is social. I can work out by myself maybe once or twice a week, but I can't do it without somebody else. I've had a workout partner since 1988 because it's a social thing when exercise takes place with it. So if you go to most gyms, people are reading books, listening to podcasts, watching YouTube, going with a trainer. They're in a class. It's a competition. There's this other thing that's got your brain stimulated, and exercise happens as a byproduct.
Yeah.
So anything that you've got going on, like cleaning the house or those types of things, even sitting down, sometimes reading, going through email, sometimes there's a function of just talking. I've got this. When somebody with ADHD is explaining it, there's the concept of body double. Sometimes they're talking out loud of what's going on. Just having somebody with you makes it easy environmentally to go forward. And so the answer to the question is focus on changing the environment to make it more fun, make it easier to self-regulate, and you'll find yourself doing that. I don't have a trick for just trying harder.
No, absolutely. Yeah. I think that's great advice, to make it somehow social, to make it interactive, to introduce another person. I think that's a great answer to Annie's question. You're terrific, Jeff.
It's interesting to me because one of the things that I don't like about society today is, as I say, it's easier for society if you do it their way. And there's a tendency to bully people to do it in a way that's really convenient, that's making it more difficult. More and more I'm finding colleges and even high schools pressing kids to focus more on technology and trying to read something on an iPad. It's actually funny. I was interviewing Dr. Russell Barkley on working memory a while ago, and we were talking about sometimes paper is high tech for many people with ADHD. And when you're bullied to go to these computer screens that are so small, I'll steal a phrase from Dr. Thomas Brown. It's like watching a basketball game through a telescope. You really can't see what's going on. is you're pressed to do that. Now, many times you just got to advocate for yourself. Like, no, I've got to print this stuff out, and I got to put it around. And I got to do it for people because of the way the ADHD brain works. Although a lot of other people are starting to struggle with that now as well. But the key really is to just be vigilant on some of this stuff and change your environment, print the stuff off, talk with other people.
Right.
You have to advocate for that stuff, and it's amazing to me how successful people can be if you advocate, but you do have to know what works.
Yeah, and experiment. Change your environment is a great tip, and find the right environment that works for you. And it's not the same for every person, that's for sure.
It's funny, Ned, because right now I'm actually working on a presentation for the annual conference on ADHD in Philadelphia. And I've got a black and white printer, and I probably print 5,000 sheets of paper in a week. And I'm writing because I have to print it all. I have to see all of, even though I'm only writing 1 or 2 slides, I have to print them all off and see them across the table in order for me to do that. And it's by far the most effective way for me. If I've got even 2 or 3 computer screens, I still don't see. I got to see the big picture, the storyline of everything in order for me to do it.
Uh-huh.
And so I just took it in my own hands and said, listen, I'm just going to have to buy a lot of copy paper because that's my way of doing it. And it's a huge difference in my performance, but really even procrastination, because if I don't have the paper, I won't do it because it's just too hard.
Right. Yeah, no, exactly. AttentionTalkRadio.com and DigCoaching.com. What can they find on each of those websites?
On Attention Talk Radio, you can go there. I have done interviews with subject matter experts, you was included, since 2010. So there's about 500 or 600 interviews with everybody. And I mean, John Rady,
wow.
You, Mr. Hollowell, Dr. Barkley,
wow.
Steve Henshaw, people at CHAD, people with ADHD. And it's a whole host of information. There's a lot of great stuff out there. At Dig Coaching, that's my coaching website. You can get access to podcasts there and my YouTube channel, which is attentiontalkvideo.com. But also, I have blogs that are there, and I have different coaching packages, and you can sign up for our newsletter and stuff like that. We give lots of insightful tips. We do a lot of trying to help illuminate how sometimes what's underneath it all is not necessarily, there's a lot of elephants in the room, if you will, and trying to illuminate some of the insights to help you go forward that are not quite what you would think. In other words, we do a lot of excavating ahas.
Good for you. You're a good excavator, Jeff.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me. It's a real pleasure to have you, and thanks for your, as always, excellent ideas.
Appreciate the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Distraction is produced by Collisions, the podcast division of CRN International. Collisions, podcasts for curious people. Today's episode was recorded by Roman Zeitlin. Our editor is the always invisible Chris Latham, and our producer is the transmogrifyingly beautiful and enchanting, brilliant, creative Sarah the Wonderful Burton.